Hello Luka, how are you? This video is for you, mate. What I'm going to show you here is how to make pastry. As you know, I make pies and I want you to learn how to make pies too. So the first thing we need is we need to wash our hands, make sure we're very clean. If we wear a baker's toque, hat, keep your hair out of the food, and we get an apron and we put an apron on. Most bakers don't tend to wear chef's uniforms. Some do, but many of them don't. When they're operating their own shop, they tend to wear a t-shirt, some comfortable jeans and shoes, and an apron. Now, next thing we need to do is make sure our work surface is clean. So what I'm doing here, it's been wiped down before, but just to make sure that it's free of bugs, I've got some alcohol and water. And just rub that over. And we're good to go. Next we need some tools. Now we need a sieve. This is for sieving the flour. What we do is we put the flour into this, we sieve it to take out any lumps. It also gives it a little bit of air. Right? We have a bigger sieve here. This is a square sieve. And what we use this for is to cut the butter into the flour. I'll show you how to use that a little later. For making pastry, we need several things. We need 300 ml of water with 45 ml, that's 3 tablespoons of white wine vinegar. We then need pastry flour, which is 9% flour, roughly, just between 8 and 9%. What I do is I take 2 pieces of flour, types of flour. One is prima cake flour. This is around about 8% protein. And I also take the Vietnamese flour, which is 9.5%. I mix the two together. This gives me, one to one, it gives me the pastry flour that I want. We also need cold butter. That's about 500 grams of butter, 1 kilo of flour, and 2 tablespoons of salt. What to do, put the salt into the liquids, that way the salt will dissolve, easier to incorporate into the flour. Next, I'm going to take the flour and I'm going to sieve it. Now, depending on your recipe, you can also add in 2 tablespoons of baking powder, which will just help with a little bit of lift. There we go. See, there's a few lumps in there. That's because this flour's been in the fridge. We wanted to keep it cool. Cold stuff is always the best friend of a baker, and most bakers usually work around about 4 o'clock in the morning and onwards from there. The reason being because it's quite cool. Here it's the middle of the day and it's getting quite warm. Now we sieved our flour. We've got 500 grams of butter here. It's also very cold. Doesn't have to be frozen, but it does pay to be cold. What it is extra dry butter, and then we just dice it up. Mix that all together, just like that. Just coat the butter with the flour. Now we've got the butter coated with the flour. We take our big sieve, which is what we're going to use for cutting the butter into the flour. Put it down, take handfuls of butter and flour, and just rub them through. Now what this does is it helps to create a consistent and even crumb, which is the curse of most bakers, right? Is how to get your butter cut to a consistent, even size, so that when you're making a pastry, you've got repeatable pastry, batch after batch after batch, and that's really important. It needs to be predictable, repeatable, and while that comes with a lot of experience, this kind of thing helps to shorten the amount of time. You get to know what your pastry should have to look like by the time you finish, and then you aim for that. Because I want to have the same repeatability from batch to batch of pastry, I use this thing. what that does is it gives me a consistent size, around about the size of corn cobs, butter packed portions. Now this is important because what happens is the flour coats the butter, and the butter stops the moisture, the water, getting to the flour. And when we're making pastry, especially a rough puff pastry, which is what this is, which is based on a short crust, is that we want to have some flakes. We want to have it a bit flaky, we want to have it a bit crumbly, but that gives a nice, soft, tender texture to the pastry. Now the bigger the pastry flakes, the flakier the pastry. The smaller the butter size, the more mealy the crust is, and becomes more like a short crust pastry. Now if you're doing flans and tarts and things like that, you might want a mealy pastry. If you're doing savoury pies, then you want a much more flaky pastry, but you don't need a puff pastry. This is why we do it this way. That's why it's called a rough puff pastry. It's not puff pastry in the purest sense, but it's a close approximation. This will produce around about 1.8 kilos of flour, or pastry dough, and with that we can make around about 15 pies. Now the warmer the butter, the easier it is to cut through this, but there's also the bigger risk that the butter will melt and then just bleed straight into the flour. We don't want that. Okay, that's the first pass. As you can see, it's kind of large crumbly pieces. We're going to pass it through once more. That will mean that any of the butter that was passed through that was a little bit long actually breaks down into small squarish pea size or corn sized pieces. And you don't want to do too much flour with this because this sieve is quite hard on your hands. And once you get after you've done a couple of kilos of pastry, you might want to stop, because your hands will be quite raw. The reason we do it this way is a lot of cooks, home cooks especially, are afraid of pastry. They're afraid of making it because they don't know what size they actually need to get, and some of the recipes and discussions about it doesn't really help. But then they make the pastry one time and they get a good result. They make the pastry the next time and they get a bad result, and they don't understand why. And there's a lot of different factors that will influence that, but primarily it'll be because they're making the pastry with their butter to different sizes each and every time. Because of that risk, I came up with the idea of using this 3mm sieve. It's a 3mm square sieve, so that I can get consistent size in my butter. And look at that, it's beautiful. Right? So I can get consistent size in my butter from batch to batch to batch. That is basically this sieve. It's the secret of my pastry dough. Now when you get into a commercial situation where you're making much larger batches of pastry, you wouldn't make pastry this way. You wouldn't make it by hand, you'd use a machine. And machines, there are all different types of machines, they'll do them different ways, and then again you have to learn the nature of your particular machine. And that, mate, is how it's supposed to look when you finish cutting your butter in. Okay, so you see that? It's very nice. Now from there you can work with your hands to make it smaller if you want it smaller, but we're not going to do that. Next, we've got to add the water. Now a lot of pastry chefs say just add it little by little, combine it in, because you don't quite know how much moisture it's going to take. Right? And that's because humidity and all that sort of thing will change the nature of the flour. If you leave the flour for a long time in the fridge, the humidity of the fridge is also going to help change the flour. So don't be afraid to push it around. Stomp it down. Okay. Making sure the salt is actually all mixed in. Make a while again, put the last lot in, you should be right with all of that. There we go. That way. Combine it together. So yeah, it's starting to combine now, come together, starting to form a dough. You don't want to overwork it. All this squeezing and rolling and pushing it around is called working the dough. And when you work it too much, then it starts to melt the butter, and then the butter isn't so nice anymore. Pastry, we lose the properties that we're looking for, which is that nice flaky sortiness. Right. It's starting to come together. There we go. And mate, that's it. That's the pastry. What we do now is we put that into the fridge for 12 hours, minimum 2 hours, but around about 12, 18 hours overnight is good. And that is lovely pie dough. What happens when it's in the fridge is the moisture that's in there, in this dough, gets all the other bits of flour that's not quite wet, and makes it all moisturise and stick together. We put that in the bowl, pick up the rest of our pastry dough. All of this is good stuff. We've cleaned the bowl, we've cleaned the bench. We don't want to lose this. Put it in there. And there you have it. Bob's your auntie's new living lover, mate. That's pastry dough for good, tasty pies.